Hello and welcome to Good Evening Britain, a Force for Good's weekly show coming to you live from our studios here in the heart of the great British city of Glasgow, with me, your host, Alistair McConnachie. We are broadcasting on all our digital platforms throughout the United Kingdom and across the world. We're bringing you quality, pro-UK comment and analysis every Wednesday from 7 until 8 p.m. on Facebook, on YouTube, on X, and also on TikTok. Folks, please do tell us where you are watching from on this winter's evening, whether you are in Scotland, England, Northern Ireland, and Wales, or elsewhere in the world. We love to hear from you. And as usual, we've got a packed show up until 8 p.m. this evening. And at the bottom of the hour, we have our guest, friend of the show, Avellina Balestri, who is going to be talking about one of Glasgow's greatest sons, Sir John Moore, soldier and heroic general. That's at 7:30. Until then, though, we've called this program 100 Days to Go, because 100 days from today, we will know the result of the Holyrood election. 100 days from today will be the 8th of May, which will be the day after the actual election itself. Because remember, this time around, they're not counting the votes on the Thursday evening. Instead, they're counting the votes on the Friday during the day. So the votes are going to be kept overnight, presumably in safe quarters, until they're counted during the day. Is this much of an improvement? Well, I suppose it might help some council employees who do the voting, who do the counting, I should say. But beyond that, it really just holds up the process in our view. An unnecessary delay until we find out, presumably on Friday afternoon, who is going to form the new executive and where the balance of the seats lie, where the 129 seats will fall. And at the moment, the SNP is unfortunately the favourite for the majority of the seats, with Reform and Labour tied in second place. Now, John Swinney has said that if he gets 65 of the 129 seats available, then he believes that's a mandate to call for another separation referendum. Goodness me, what an original plan. What an original policy. Isn't that wonderful? Who would have thought that John Swinney would call for yet another referendum on separation? But hey, that's his bag. You know, the Scottish National Party wouldn't be much were it not for that, and so that's to be expected. Some of his supporters saying, "Oh no, don't make it 65 SNP seats, make it 65, including the other parties, such as the Scottish Cabbage Party, otherwise known as the Soggy Greens. Include them in the 65. And that way you'll have more certainty of being able to call for a referendum." But clearly, from his perspective, that doesn't make any sense, because he wants people not to vote for the Greens, but to vote for the SNP. So he's saying it has to be 65 SNP seats. So it's our job between now and then to do our best to ensure that doesn't happen, and to do our best to encourage people to vote anybody but the SNP or the Greens or any other parties that might be disguising their separatist intentions. There's Alba, and there's a new one on the scene as well, which I won't mention now, but I'll mention nearer the time as well, that also wants separation. So before we go ahead with the show, folks, if you're watching on X, please do give us a repost. That really helps the algorithm. If you're watching on YouTube, please give us a thumbs up. And please give us a share. And if you're watching on Facebook, please give us a thumbs up and please give us a share and leave a comment on any of these platforms, because that helps to get the message out there. Our patriotic UK position. Del Hart on TikTok says, we said no in 2014. Where is the democracy? No means no. Quite correct, Del. I agree with you 100%. Brizzo joined. Hi to Brizzo. This is Scotland's premier pro-UK podcast. And the national newspaper has a podcast, which includes its editor, who's a young woman, and she talks to presumably other journalists on the National around these sorts of same issues. And we're much better at it, of course, than the National is. But they did say something ridiculous. I think it must have been this week. And they claimed on the National podcast that Holyrood elections are, quote, always have a higher turnout than UK elections. And if you don't believe me, let's run the clip right now.
That's what makes this election so interesting. And I don't know, maybe it does give hope. Maybe it does give a little bit of hope. And maybe folk will get out to vote. Like we've seen with Holyrood, that it always has a higher turnout than UK elections. So yeah, it's super interesting what she said, and
definitely.
Yeah, we'll dive deeper.
Well, that certainly looks like a compelling broadcast. But I do want to pick up the lady on the left there who said, quote, Holyrood always has a higher turnout than UK elections. Always than UK elections. Well, because this is a force for good and because it is Scotland and Britain's premier pro-union podcast, we've already got these statistics ready. So let's fire up the graphic which explains it all. As we say here, Westminster enjoys greater democratic legitimacy in Scotland as measured by percentage turnout than Holyrood. And there on the left, we have the Westminster general election turnout in Scotland specifically. And on the right, we have Holyrood election turnout. And we've got the last 5 general elections in Scotland. That's 2010, 15, 17, 19, and 2024. And the last 5 at Holyrood, 2003, 7, 11, 16, and 21. And as you see there, in the average for the Westminster general election turnout in Scotland over the last 5 Westminster elections is 65.7%. And the average Holyrood election turnout over the last 5 Holyrood elections is 54%. So 11, almost 12% average higher turnout at Westminster. Now, the lady was perhaps correct on one point in 2021, the Holyrood election turnout was 63.5, compared to the last Westminster election in 2024, which is 59.2. But she's clearly incorrect in stating, quote, Holyrood always has a higher turnout than UK elections. It's simply just not true. And as we say there, Scottish nationalists don't like to be reminded that we as Scots self-determine at the ballot box more with Westminster than with Holyrood. Okay. So we just have to mention the truth of that, don't we? We don't like to see complete nonsense going unchallenged. Well, we're here to challenge complete nonsense. That's what we are about. So we are highly engaged here at with the Westminster elections on a level that's greater than at the Holyrood elections, which is very interesting. That's always really been the case. In a few minutes, we'll go on to the state of play in Wales, which is just absurd. Absolutely absurd. But let's just say hi to a few people who have come in. Derek was first tonight. Good evening, everyone. I hope you're well. I hope no one has had any damage after the recent storms. Oksana says hi. Hope you are well. Catherine says hi. Cal suggests that they're voting for Reform or even better, Advance UK. Don't know if Advance UK has got any candidates in Scotland. I certainly haven't heard of any at this stage. Maybe closer to the time we'll know about that. But Reform will probably have hoovered up the vast majority of eligible candidates, I should imagine, for that political tendency. Stephen comes in, says, seats don't represent a mandate, as you can get a majority of seats at Holyrood and still only represent around 30% of the total Scottish electorate. That's certainly true. A mandate really has to include not just the number of seats, but actually a majority of the actual people who voted for that party on the day. Otherwise, it's not really a proper mandate, is it? We need a super majority, not just seats, but actually of people, certainly before you do anything like think about breaking up the United Kingdom. Oksana says, we want a party who gives us less immigration. Second that emotion. Absolutely. Hi to Derek. Good to see Derek as always. And British Legends. Hi to you, British Legends. Hope you and the family are well. So we spoke there about the Scottish Parliament. Here is the Labour First Minister of Wales, who is a lady called Eleanor Morgan. And she was on the telly on Sky News with Trevor Phillips, and she said, real possibility of union breakup after May elections. Labour's Welsh First Minister admits results could have profound implications for the future of the UK. And what she's pointing out here, which is a fair enough comment, is that if you have the SNP running Scotland, if Plaid Cymru win in Wales, and you've got Sinn Féin in Northern Ireland, then you would have three separatist parties controlling those three countries. And that wouldn't be very good, would it? goodness me, not from a unionist point of view. She says here, quote, "The elections in May could have profound implications, not just for the people of Wales, but also for the situation in the whole of the UK. The danger is real." And I think the point that she's making here is vote for Labour if you support the union. And she does point out, she says, the fact that Plaid and possibly the Greens may be distracted constantly, not looking at improving people's bread and butter issues, bringing those waiting lists down, building schools and filling potholes like what we've done since I've been First Minister. So there's a challenge ahead of us, and these are tricky times, and we're clear about that. And so she's certainly worried, and I guess she ought to be as well. And does she have a solution to this? Well, you will not be surprised to know that because it's Labour, the solution is always the wrong solution. And her solution is, of course, that Wales needs more devolution, obviously. She says here, "It is in the UK Labour government's interest to make sure that they can support us in every way, including perhaps giving us more power in certain areas that we've been requesting for a while." She called for, in an earlier speech, quote, "a new chapter of devolution," and said Wales should have the same powers as Scotland. Well, that's just not really going to help, is it? And thankfully, it was the Tory, Darren Millar, leader of the Welsh Tories, who said, quote, who said that the First Minister was ushering in the breakup of the UK by demanding more devolved powers. Welsh First Minister accused of ushering in breakup of the UK. Darren Millar said that she was, quote, building the scaffolding. That's a good phrase. By seeking the devolution of policing, rail, youth justice, and the Crown estate. He went on to say, quote, by constantly demanding more powers and more control over issues such as policing and justice, you're actually building the scaffolding for the very breakup of the United Kingdom that you claim to want to defend. Instead of trying to out-nationalist the nationalists by clamouring for more powers, why don't you focus on the powers you already have to turn around the crisis in our NHS, to improve our education system, and to get Wales's economy moving? Well, 100%. Of course, that's what you need to do. But it really is awful, isn't it, that we're at this situation now in Wales where, thanks to Tony Blair, of course, you could have a separatist executive running the Senedd. And it's even more ridiculous when you look at the turnout figures for the Senedd, which are consistently abysmal. Now, a minute ago, I showed you the Westminster versus Holyrood turnout figures in the last 5 elections to each of these parliaments. Let's now look at the Welsh turnout figures. Again, Westminster enjoys greater democratic legitimacy as measured by percentage turnout than the Senedd. Now look at the Senedd figures from 1999 through the 6 elections up to the last one in 2021. Not a single one of these elections to the Senedd even broke the 50% turnout barrier. The highest they've ever had was a 46.6% turnout in 2021. And the average over the last 6 elections to the Senedd is 43.7% turnout, never even broken 50%. And yet we've got the serious threat of a separatist organisation trying to break up Wales from England when the Parliament, the assembly that they're doing it in, has never even had a turnout of 50% of the population eligible to vote in Wales. It's beyond belief. Now, if you compare it to the last 6 Westminster general election turnouts in Wales, you see that over the last 6 Westminster elections, the average turnout is 64%. It's not brilliant, but it's considerably better than the Senedd turnout of 43.7. So again, the Welsh self-determine more with Westminster than with the Senedd. Okay. Okay. So seriously, that's a remarkable figure, but it just shows the extent to which democracy can really, well, is that democracy? Is that, if you're not getting a 50% turnout, what kind of legitimacy does that assembly even have? Does it have any real democratic legitimacy? That's the question. Stephen says, again, 3 separatist parties that represent a minority of the total electorate. Yeah, yeah. Catherine says that unionists need to back one party. Well, yeah, that's easier said than done. That's the problem, isn't it? Again, Stephen says, devolution's domino effect at work again. Adam, good to see Adam again. Long time no see. Yes, it's been a few months, Adam. Glad to hear you're back in the house. Paul speaks for many of us. Eternal shame on Tony Blair, he says. Yeah. Paul, Stephen, well known for not being a fan of devolution, says it stinks. Stephen sends articles into our Facebook page on a regular basis. Please do check out our Facebook page for some of Stephen's articles where he concentrates on these facts and figures. Now, we've got our guest coming up at the bottom of the hour. That's Avellina Balestri. Before we speak to Avellina, though, let's continue with our Scottish politics. As I say, 100 days from now, we're going to know who is going to be running the country. We're going to know, is it going to be the SNP, or are they going to have to form some kind of coalition, or will it be a surprise victory for parties that we never thought would ever manage it? It'll all be revealed on Friday the 8th when the vote comes in. But one of the main players, of course, will be the Reform Party. And their leader in Scotland is called Malcolm Offord. And when he launched the campaign, he was pigeonholed by STV News. This was back on the 15th of January. And they wanted him to know if he approved of an advertisement that Reform had used at the Hamilton by-election, where they had accused, or rather they had highlighted some words that Anas Sarwar, Labour leader, had made to a meeting of a Pakistani group. And that caught Mr. Offord on the hop. And it's fair to say that he didn't really have an answer for it. And famously, it got 1.4 million views on YouTube after one of Offord's aides stepped in and asked the STV ban to stop pestering Offord with that line of questioning. Did Offord think that this was appropriate, that they had racialized politics in this way, and so on? What Offord should have said was simply that Anas Sarwar was out of line in making specific ethnic appeals, which could be considered sectarian, and that reform was perfectly correct to bring that to light. And for those of you who have not seen the actual matter in question, here is what Anas Sarwar said back in 2022.
We will only truly get real power if we just have more Pakistanis sitting in council chambers and parliaments, but actually having more Pakistanis and South Asians sitting in the corridors of power making the decisions. And that's where I'll end tonight, is to say the change is coming. And the days where our South Asian community are viewed as a vote bank or a curry bank are well and truly gone. The days where South Asian communities get to lead political parties and get to lead countries is now upon us. The days when South Asian communities get to decide not just which school our children go to, but what they are taught in those schools is also coming.
Indeed. So that was the issue, and Offord has since returned to this matter, and in yesterday's National, Offord needs written instructions to respond to quote-unquote racist ad question. And when he flummoxed the first question, we simply pointed out that what he needed to do was to simply say, reform will call out ethnic sectarianism and ethnic favoritism from any politician, and to do so on behalf of all the people of Scotland. And it's very simple, a simple matter. And pleasantly pleased to see Offord's new approach to this. This is from the National yesterday. Quoting Sarwar, he said, quote, "The days when South Asian communities get to decide not just which school our children go to, but what they're taught in these schools is also coming," close quote. Offord said, "I think that's language that we shouldn't have from any part of our community, one way or the other." These were his words. And I think when we talk about these things, we have to be very fair and understand the context in which they were spoken. So basically, he's saying there, I think that's language that we shouldn't have from any part of our community, one way or the other. Well, that's not a bad answer, to be frank with you. The National kept pestering him and saying if he was defending the way that Reform had attacked Sarwar during the by-election campaign, and Offord responded, quote, "I think I've covered the point." So anyway, I would like to see Offord and basically all politicians, whatever party, standing up to those sorts of questions and being able to deal with them without getting on the back foot and being concerned or afraid of them. So what time is it? It's the bottom of the hour. Dean says the symbol behind him is not English, Irish, or Scottish. Well, I guess that's so. And it wasn't that long ago. It was just like, it was actually on the 29th of September 2022 when he made those remarks. That's probably still going to haunt him, if that's the correct word, in the run-up until 7th of May. And if I was Reform, I would be making hay on that quite frankly. Adam says, they keep saying reform is pro-independence. Well, that's simply not really so, is it? The leader said that a referendum on independence is not the priority of the people now, but it could be in, say, a decade's time, but he doubts it. That doesn't make him pro-independence, does it? No, it doesn't. And all he's done is he's just kicked he's kicked the ball down the road 10 years, and maybe in 10 years he'll say exactly the same thing and kick the ball down the road for another 10 years. That's how politics works. Now, folk on TikTok, we're going to be bringing in our guest, Avellina. If you want to see Avellina, please go to, on TikTok, go to our YouTube page, youtube.com/UK A Force for Good. But until then, I'm going to have to say goodbye to the folk on TikTok. And thank you very much for watching. There we go, folks. Please say hello to our friend Avellina.
Hello, Alistair.
Hello, Avellina. And I do like your get up tonight. You look very historic, if you don't mind me saying. You look appropriately attired to be discussing these matters of it's the 18th century tonight, isn't it?
Well, it sort of straddles this gentleman's story straddles the 18th into the early 19th century. So he is long 18th century, which kind of can traditionally be considered 1688 to 1815 or 1820, depending on how people frame it. But approximately that, the second 100 Years' War between England/Britain and France.
Yes, well, the person we're going to talk about tonight is actually a son of Glasgow, and he died as Sir John Moore, and he has got a statue in George Square. That's him there. It says, to commemorate the military service of Lieutenant General Sir John Moore, native of Glasgow, his fellow citizens have erected this monument. And I think that was in it was the first monument, I believe, to be erected in George Square, and it was to his memory. Now, that statue is currently taken down along with all the other statues in George Square because they are renovating it and renovating the entire square, hoping to open it up towards the end of next year. This year, the end of this year. So let's hope that they bring that statue back.
Yeah, he needs to make a glorious return.
He does. And you look at his left hand there, that seems to be clutching thin air. And the problem with that is that there is a sword that's meant to be in that hand.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not sure how the sword ever got separated from him, but there was, they thought that, well, what they'll do is they'll replace the sword, but
there's an irony to that, which I'm going to save it for the story in sequence, but there's a bit of an irony to that sword question in his story.
Okay. Well, the reason that they're not going to replace it is because some of the anti-British, for want of a better phrase, councillors thought it would be too militaristic to put swords in his hand. And
okay, that really is a whole nother level of stupid.
Yeah, and they didn't want that to be properly sorted. So we're going to get.
Who complained about that? The French, what was it?
Well, you might have something to say about this when you talk to us more about it, because one of the councillors, who's a well-known kind of agitator for these matters, said that it was it was something to do with, like, it was emblematic of oppression of colonial subjects. Now, I don't know if John will get into even any of that kind of stuff in the sense of wars against colonial people.
Suppressing rebellions at different points, I suppose. But I'm like, what do you expect from? What do you expect from any empire in the history of humanity, or nation state for that matter. So blaming him uniquely for that is a certain type of self-loathing that is truly beyond the mortal ken.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know to what extent it's self-loathing with this guy, because he's actually a Rastafarian. So it's not like a white man that got upset about it, which would be kind of self-loathing. It was more from an ethnic kind of agitation that it was coming. Yeah.
Which again, I would almost then point to any ethnic group in the history of mankind, and if that ethnic group ever had any power over anything, and had the power to dominate literally any square miles of land, and people inhabited that land, then they too would be involved in some kind of involvement in putting down any kind of unrest. I mean, that's the way it works in the world of any kind of power dynamic whatsoever by any ethnic group at any point in history.
That's absolutely so. That's absolutely so. It's just that's the nature of, as you say, the power dynamic involved in those sorts of things. Now, let's get into our subject. John Moore, just to keep people in the picture, he was born on the 13th of November, 1761 in Glasgow. And so let's take the story from there over the next 15, 20 minutes.
Certainly. So John Moore, his father was a doctor, a cleric, an author, and a tutor, so a little bit of everything in the Scottish Enlightenment, so to speak, wore many hats. And he ended up getting a job tutoring the son of the Duke of Hamilton. And this put young John Moore into contact with Douglas, the son he was supposed to be a companion with. And so John Moore comes from, this middle-class upbringing, sort of a middle-class gentleman family. And is now being brought into the realm of the Scottish nobility. And so at first, young Douglas thinks that, he's a bit entitled and sees himself as quite above young Moore, his companion. And so, treats him kind of like just a plaything, his inferior, but not really a friendship at first. Then they end up in a duel. Well, it was supposed to be a mock duel. It was supposed to be just Douglas trying out his fencing skills on this little twerpy son of his tutor. And he fully expected that young John, aka Jack, would just let him win, because that was, what you would have expected. He did not let him win. He would never let anybody push him around his whole life. And so he refuses to just let him win. He fights very ferociously in this little fencing match. And then Douglas gets so frustrated by this that he inadvertently stabs the kid. It was an accident. He was just kind of angry, but accidentally wounds him in the side. And Jack's reaction to this is to look at his now wound that's gushing blood onto the floor, turn back to Douglas and say very boldly, "Ha!" and hold up his sword, which again, I'm sort of like, what? You took his sword away? No, statue people. And so Douglas actually, shocked that this kid still wants to fight after getting lanced in the side. And secondly, is genuinely horrified that he stabbed him. He did not mean to do that. He didn't mean to hurt him. And so he's quite panicked about the whole thing. Fortunately, his so Jack's dad shows up and patches his son up and salvages the thing. Douglas is very remorseful. He is very sorry. And after this, they actually become good friends. They do bond. He's kind of learned his lesson. He wasn't being very nice, and he becomes like a patron to John afterwards. So that's one childhood story. There are many others. He was a very rambunctious youth, and we have stories of him also accidentally injuring people. Like one time he was messing around with his dad's pistol. This is John Moore was messing around with his dad's pistol when he was like 10 or 11, and he thinks it's not loaded. And so he's randomly, pulling the trigger off to the side, you know, bang, bang, accidentally shoots a maid in the other room. But fortunately, again, she's not too badly injured. She got like winged, I think. And so she was patched up, but that could have ended way worse. And so then you also have stories of when he's going on progress to Europe, the continent, with the Hamilton family, and his dad is going as the tutor and he's going as the companion to Douglas. He gets into a good old-fashioned fist fight with some young sons of French aristocrats, and nearly creates an international incident over this because he basically just punches a bunch of them when they make fun of his comparatively plain clothing. And so his dad has to diffuse the situation and try to, I'm putting him on, I'm grounding him. It does not create an international incident and all this stuff. And then in the immediate aftermath of that, young Jack climbs a volcano. So he climbs a partially active volcano in Italy. Gets a bit burnt doing so, but survives because he's Scottish, and Scots, it seems like in these stories, often they tread that line between crazy and indestructible, and then eventually destructible, but it takes a lot. It takes a lot to take them down. So this is just in his childhood. And then by the time he is 16 or so, he joins the military. And this was in part inspired during his journeys through continental Europe. When he was in Prussia, he met a Jacobite exile gentleman. He'd been exiled from the 45 and was now a mercenary in Prussia, who took a shine to teenage John and gives him a copy of the poetry of Horace, which will become something that he treasures throughout his life. And it actually, spending time with this guy becomes his inspiration for joining the military, the stories of military glory and whatnot. So he ends up joining the British military. He was invited by the guy to join, become a mercenary, essentially. But he's like, no, I would rather serve my own country. So he ends up in the British Army at a young age, about 16. And his first tour of duty is basically in North America, in the American Revolution. And so one little anecdote from that is that, similar to another Scottish soldier that we talked about on this program, Major Patrick Ferguson, he had the opportunity to shoot a rebel officer, but he didn't do it because his back was turned to him, and there was that code of ethics holding him back, that he wouldn't shoot a man who had his back turned. So those were his ethics when he was in his teens. Now, we come around to, as his career goes forward, possibly what some people were talking about when they were protesting him, I guess, in the statue in George Square, was that he and his regiment and whatnot are involved in the suppression after the American Revolution. Kind of derails for them. He ends up in the suppression both of a slave rising in the Sugar Islands, and then in the United Men rising in 1798 in Ireland. So that is maybe what they're talking about.
Yeah, that'll be what they're talking about.
That is probably
especially
what they're talking
the slave one anyway. That's what.
Yeah, the slave one. And I'm sort of like, look, on a certain note, I get, like, I understand that. Is it the ideal? It's kind of similarly, honestly, with Patrick Ferguson, who himself had been sent to keep the Sugar Islands pacified in his tour of duty, and who himself had monies put down in sugar and so forth. So, I mean, can we look at the past and say, were these things perfect? No, they were not perfect, the actions of these characters. But certainly when it comes to military officers going with their regiments, I'm sorry, but that is basically going to be their duty. To go where they are sent and to maintain order in the empire. And again, we can maybe we can maybe point to certain conscientious objectors to that, who were very abolitionist, and say, good for them for being that kind of dedicated to seeing things from that kind of humanistic moral perspective. But at the same time, it's worth noting that in the case of Sir John Moore, he was rather reform-minded himself in terms of both the situation in Ireland and the Sugar Islands. His personal political beliefs at least leaned toward reformation of the empire with regards to the treatment of both the peoples in this case. That having been said, again, he wasn't, you're not going to expect perfection in anybody's opinions, but it was far from a black and white case, and also it was the case that he was a military man, and you do, generally speaking, go where you are sent, and primarily you are being sent to maintain peace and maintain order throughout the empire. So that being the case, he did have a very good reputation, however, for integrity, both in personal and career life, from those who knew him well. And I'm just going to scroll briefly through my many notes. Last night I went sort of on a binge of notes because there were just so many interesting things.
If we take it to the point of we may have to leap a few years, but I
am definitely going to leap him to the Napoleonic Wars in just one moment. But I'm just looking for one quote that quite summed up. What I will say is that basically he became, there we go, I found it. So a contemporary said of him, everything and more was real, solid, and unbending. He was penetrative and reflective. His manner was singularly agreeable to those whom he liked, but to those who he did not esteem, his bearing was severe. And this is quite true in general of his character, that he was considered just a man of great integrity. Another anecdote kind of highlights this, about the fact that when he eventually, through his services, as he moves up in the ranks of the British establishment, he eventually gets knighted for his services in various capacities, and his main capacity being in the Napoleonic Wars against the French. He never lets that go to his head. They say even after he is knighted and after all these things happen, if he is invited to a glittering assembly, or he is invited to the home of comparatively poorer friends of a more obscure background and a lesser class, he will cancel any important engagement. If it's, any important social engagement, shall we say, if it's not business, if it's not strictly like duty, he will cancel it in order to spend time with those friends. And when pressed upon the point, he just is very much like, hey, these people, they remembered me when I was nothing, when it didn't, gain them anything to be my friends. And these other people, they're just sort of spending time around me because now I've gained some fame. And so that was a good example of how he was. In terms of his military reputation, he was a strict disciplinarian, especially down the line when he gets involved. So then we get to Napoleonic Wars. He's most famous for his role in Spain. So he was involved in basically aiding Spanish resistance against Napoleon, to put it simply. And so he goes out to attempt to ally with those factions that are opposed to Napoleonic rule. And this is when he does deal with a lot of complications in terms of trying to make that alliance work and to supply his army and all of the rest of it. And he does have a very difficult time with regard to controlling looting and booty hunting. And also, sadly, the fact that his men were oftentimes very hungry and in desperate way because they weren't getting properly supplies because of difficulties with the alliance. And he could be very strict against looting against the civilians, because he was very worried about breaking the alliance entirely, because it would turn off the civilians to working with them at all. But at the same time, even though he was quite tough, he also was very inspiring to them, because he would tough it out with them. He didn't basically ask anyone to go farther than he himself was willing to go. And this really gets highlighted toward the end of his life. So the Battle of Corunna is, the battle in which he is killed in Spain. He has to retreat from Spain because of all of the complications. And so it's this kind of interesting retreating victory that goes on with Corunna, which on the one hand, it's like a bittersweet sort of situation for the British. But suffice to say, one of the really memorable moments from that is that he's riding around trying to rally his men. And he, one of the cries he makes to the Highlanders is, Highlanders, remember Egypt, remember the Aberdonians on the banks of the Nile and all this, because he had also been in the campaign in Egypt, also against the French, as the struggles for control of Egypt were going on between the different empires. And so he is encouraging them, and then one man gets struck and starts to cry out and causes the line to sort of back away in a bit of a panic, and Moore lectures him and says, my good fellow, we must learn to bear these things better. And so some people are like, are you being unreasonable? But then shortly after this, he gets hit by a cannonball, basically. And so Moore, he gets horrendously injured. He gets like his shoulder torn off by this cannonball. And Moore really handles it well, really, really well for a long time. And so he's basically not reacting that much to this horrendous imagery where everybody around him is just like, oh my God, dude. And so he's like, well, yeah, I'm not okay, but I'm not making a fuss or anything. And so he starts to get, taken off his, horse, carried off, and he en route through the town, and he's being taken to a house, and one of his manservant who is Frenchman, ironically, is quite freaked out to see him looking like that. It does not look good, and so he starts to kind of freak, and so Moore very calmly and with a smile says in French, "My friend, this is nothing." Which I'm like, no, it's something. But anyway, he's holding himself together really well. But he does seem a little like he's starting to get nerved out. But when his close friend ends up coming over, he says, Anderson, don't leave me. And he says to him, they start to try to take his sword off of him. We're going back to the irony of the sword. And his sword gets kind of caught. And they're afraid of the sword jabbing into his injuries. And he's saying, no, don't take it off me. It's best that the sword leave the field with me. Do not leave it to the enemy. And so basically he gets taken into the house, and they start to operate, and it's all quite like intense pain, and he turns completely white, and he's biting his lip, but he does not cry out. So he kind of merits that don't cry out business in the beginning. So he's at least holding together. But when he does break down is when he tries to dictate a message to his mother, who he always was very, very close to. He was very close to his parents. And so then he breaks down finally and can't get, he says, I have so much to say, but I can't get it out. And he starts to choke up. So very tragic.
I'm not surprised. Well, let's fast forward, because we've only got a couple of minutes, but let's fast forward to the actual burial, because that's what he's kind of famous for, isn't it?
It is what yes, because he gets the wonderful poem written about him.
I'd like to just say a few words myself about that, because the poem was called The Burial of Sir John Moore after Corunna, and it was written in 1817 by Charles Wolfe, who was
a relative of General James Wolfe, by the way.
Right. And it was, I'm led to understand that it was widely taught in schools because it had a snappy tone to it, a snappy rhythm to it. And I'll just read a quick verse. Slowly and sadly we laid him down from the field of his fame, fresh and gory. We carved not a line and we raised not a stone, but we left him alone with his glory. And so several verses with what's been called the rhythm of a drum beat.
And I can definitely see that.
There's a good article about this, which we'll put up in the links, about the extent to which this poem, and I'm quoting from the article, it goes, the article argues that, quote, the presence of Wolfe's poem, that's about the burial of Sir John Moore, in the minds of ordinary individuals played its part in creating the social expectations that led to the establishment of the national cemeteries in the United States. And
interesting.
Thus, in due course, to the mass memorialization of World War I.
Oh, wow.
And so that's about that poem. And
my favorite bit of that poem is this line, which is, lightly they'll talk of the spirit that's gone, and o'er his cold ashes upbraid him, but little he'll reck if they let him sleep on in the grave where a Briton has laid him.
Yep.
So it's very, and then so just to wrap him up there, is the fact that in the aftermath, his second in command also has, he is wounded as well, and he's very stoically handling getting operated on and doesn't cry out during said operation. But then when they come and they tell him Moore has died, then he breaks down weeping. And this was not uncommon, because although he was a tough disciplinarian, his men were very inspired by him. And so long after that, many people who served under him would continue to proudly call themselves Moore's men. And it was a real rallying point for them to have that kind of identity. And even his enemies.
It absolutely must have been, because just to end, we do have a very good picture of his, that's not his grave, but it's a memorial to him in Westminster Abbey. St. Paul's Cathedral. Yeah. St. Paul's Cathedral says, sacred to the memory of Lieutenant General Sir John Moore, who was born in Glasgow in the year 1761. He fought for his country in America, in Corsica, in the West Indies, in Holland, Egypt, and Spain. And on the 16th of January, which was just 10 days ago or so, was slain by a cannonball at Corunna. And that's an amazing piece of marble there.
It is, very much so. Beautiful.
If his burial in the battlefield wasn't too big, that's certainly something that reminds us of it and pays.
And on the battlefield, just very, very briefly, I just want to finish with this one bit, which is that Marshal Soult, so the French commander, greatly respected Moore. They both had a kind of old-fashioned chivalry to them. Moore was renowned for his chivalry once when capturing a high-ranking French officer. He gave him his own sword to fill his empty scabbard. He invited him to dinner. He gave him his own underclothing because of the cold. So he's very chivalrous to different French commanders. So in response to this, Marshal Soult, when he discovers the place where Moore was laid, he erects a plaque and with an inscription from Horace, the classical poet that Moore loved so well. And it reads, "So it is true in the long sleep of death our hero lies, whilst honor with bright faith, truth and justice unashamedly weep for their one incomparable son."
Well, there you go. There you go. Okay. It's certainly gone down in history. And not only is there a statue, hopefully to be returned to George
with
Square.
Sword in hand. With sword in hand.
Ideally, but probably unlikely. There's also a pub in Argyle Street called the Sir John Moore. So for all those Glaswegians who may have been in it before and didn't quite know who the chap was,
now they are contractually obligated when they next go in to raise a pint to his memory and honor with a sword in the other hand.
I'll say so. Avellina, it's been a blast as always. Thank you very much for coming on. We'll have you back on, of course, again this year. I know you've got plenty of Scottish and British.
We still got to get around to Sir Hugh Mackay. I keep threatening to do Sir Hugh Mackay, and then the reason why it was like I just recently saw anniversary of Moore's death, and I'm like, oh well, it's timely. But yes, yeah. Next time round, I think we should finally get round to Sir Hugh. Get that in the bag.
Let's do that. And if people would like to see your various songs and so on, we'll be putting this full interview up as we always do on our YouTube page. But your YouTube page is youtube.com/@Avellina Balestri, Avellina Balestri, for those listening on audio podcast only. So let's say goodnight. And
thank you so much, Alistair.
Folks, let's thank Avellina in the chat. Cheers then.
Bye.
Good night. Yep. Great stuff. Thank you to Avellina for keeping it real and for keeping us informed about things. Scotland Scorpion says that she's at St Enoch Centre tomorrow, which is just round the corner from the Sir John Moore. Great. Yeah, do pop along. Oksana says, thanks, Avellina. It's great that we at A Force for Good have got these people who are so knowledgeable about our British history throughout the world. So thanks, Avellina, for another interesting talk. Now, folks, we are not going to be broadcasting next week. We've got a very busy week doing stuff for the organisation. We're not going to be able to fit in the broadcast next Wednesday as it happens. But don't worry, we'll be back again. In the meantime, though, I think we've covered everything that we need to cover. Thank you for the comments that people have made. If you haven't already, please do share this broadcast or repost it on Twitter, and just helps to get the message out. So until next time, folks, it just remains for me to say, God bless the United Kingdom and God save the King. See you next time.